In 1736, a young Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha stepped onto British soil, a pawn in a continental power play. She was barely 17, arriving in a cold, fog-drenched London to marry Frederick, the Prince of Wales. Behind her lay the familiar forests of Germany. Ahead, a court rife with venomous intrigue and a royal family fractured by hatred. Though she appeared fragile and silent, Augusta possessed a resilience that would soon unnerve her enemies. This was not just a marriage. It was the entry of a silent architect into the heart of the British Empire. Ready to build a legacy that would endure, the court of King George II was a theater of cruelty. The king openly loathed his eldest son, Frederick, and by extension, his new daughter-in-law. Augusta found herself caught in the crossfire of a generational war. In the gilded halls of St. James's Palace, the air was thick with the scent of beeswax and malice. Every bow was a test, every smile a potential trap. Augusta learned quickly that survival depended on silence and observation. She moved through the shadows of the throne room, a ghost in silk, recording the weaknesses of those who sought to belittle her in the flickering candlelight. Isolated by language and custom, Augusta spent her early months in a state of watchful seclusion. She was a stranger in a land that viewed her with suspicion. While the public saw a quiet, perhaps dull princess, Augusta was secretly mastering the English tongue and the complex web of British politics. She spent hours in the library, illuminated by the guttering flame of a single candle, studying the histories and laws of her new home. She was not merely a bride, she was an apprentice to power, preparing for a time when her voice would finally be heard in the halls of Westminster. The summer of 1737 brought a moment of terrifying defiance. As Augusta went into labor with her first child at Hampton Court, Frederick, in a desperate bid to spite his father, forced her into a carriage. They fled in the middle of the night to St. James's Palace, Augusta enduring the agonizing pains of childbirth over bumpy roads and cold cobblestones. It was a reckless gamble for independence that nearly cost her life. This harrowing journey through the dark became a symbol of her endurance and the prince's total break from the king's suffocating control, witnessed only by the stars. Leicester House became the heart of a rival court. Under Augusta's steadying influence, it transformed into a haven for intellectuals, politicians, and artists who were disillusioned with the king. While Frederick was the face of the opposition, Augusta was its soul. She curated their social circle with surgical precision, ensuring that the next generation of leaders was loyal to her family. The atmosphere was one of refined rebellion, where whispered plans for the future of the British Empire were forged in the soft glow of candlelight, away from the prying eyes of the king's many spies and informants. In 1751, tragedy struck with the sudden death of Prince Frederick. The poor Fred of history was gone, leaving Augusta a widow with 9 children and an incredibly precarious future. The political landscape shifted overnight. The king's ministers expected her to fade into the background, a grieving relic of a failed rebellion. But Augusta knew that the survival of her eldest son, the future George III, rested solely on her shoulders. In the cold, quiet rooms of her mourning, she shed her role as a consort and donned the mantle of a political guardian, fiercer and more focused than she had ever been. The battle for the custody and education of the young Prince George began in earnest. The king and his ministers sought to remove the boy from Augusta's influence, fearing she would raise him to be a puppet of her own ambitions. Augusta fought back with a quiet, unrelenting iron will. She navigated the treacherous waters of Parliament and the Privy Council, using her status as a mother to claim the moral high ground. She knew that whoever controlled the prince controlled the future of the crown. The halls of power were cold, but Augusta's resolve was a burning ember in the dark. Needing a trusted ally in a world of enemies, Augusta turned to John Stuart, the Earl of Bute. Their close relationship sparked scandalous rumors that echoed through the streets of London and the halls of Westminster. Whether their bond was romantic or purely political, Bute became Augusta's primary instrument in shaping the mind of the future king. Together, they retreated into the shadows of Kew and Leicester House, creating a private world where they could mold the young George III into the ideal monarch, far removed from the corruption and debauchery of his grandfather's aging and decadent court. Augusta's educational program for her son was rigorous and isolationist. She famously urged him to be king, a command to rise above the petty factionalism and moral decay of the Georgian era. She instilled in him a sense of duty, piety, and absolute sovereignty. This was her greatest work, the creation of a monarch who would rule for 60 years. Through the long evenings of study and prayer, Augusta was the architect of his character, weaving her own ambitions and values into the very fabric of his identity, ensuring her influence would last for generations to come. By the time George II finally passed and her son ascended the throne, Augusta had become one of the most powerful and most hated women in England. She was the Princess Dowager, a figure of mystery and maternal control. She had navigated decades of royal hatred, personal loss, and political betrayal to see her son crowned. Though the public decried her influence, Augusta remained a silent titan, a woman who had mastered the art of quiet power in a world that sought to silence her. Her story is one of survival, strategy, and the enduring strength of the mother of a king. As the news of George II's sudden death rippled through the cold corridors of Kensington Palace, Augusta received the word at Leicester House with a calculated, chilling calm. The era of her royal tormentor was finally over, and the era of her son had begun. While the court scrambled in a frantic panic of shifting loyalties and whispered allegiances, she remained a pillar of granite in the storm. She knew that the transition of power was a fragile window, a moment where enemies would strike to fill the vacuum. Her primary goal was to ensure George III did not fall under the sway of the old Whig ministers who had once belittled his father. Rumors began to swirl like the thick yellow London fog around Augusta's close relationship with John Stuart, the Earl of Bute. To the vitriolic public, he was her illicit lover. To Augusta, he was the only mind she truly trusted to tutor her son in the rigid principles of Tory governance. In the secluded wood-paneled libraries of Leicester House, they spent hours poring over maps and ancient treaties. The infamous boot and petticoat scandal was born in these quiet moments of strategy, fueled by a press that could not conceive of a woman exercising political power through intellectual partnership rather than carnal influence. "George, be a king," she famously. "George, be a king," she famously exhorted, a phrase that carried the heavy weight of her own thwarted ambitions and years of survival. She instilled in him a rigid sense of moral duty and a profound distrust of the established political machines. This isolation made him the king she wanted, but it also made him a stranger to his own people, creating a kingly figure who preferred the sanctuary of his family over the noise of Parliament. Outside the palace gates, the mood of London was turning ugly and volatile. Effigies of a boot and a petticoat were burned in the narrow streets, a crude symbolic attack on Augusta and Bute. The Princess Dowager heard the muffled roars of the angry crowd from behind her heavy velvet curtains. To her, the public was a hydra-headed monster, fickle and inherently cruel. She had survived the hatred of a king, she would survive the hatred of the mob. Her resolve only hardened as the political pamphlets grew more vicious, painting her as a foreign she-wolf manipulating the crown from the deep shadows of the palace. On the day of George III's coronation, Augusta watched from a place of high honor, yet she felt the sharp sting of her technical exclusion from the throne itself. She was the mother of the sovereign, the architect of this grand moment, yet she remained a figure in the background. As the crown was lowered onto her son's head in Westminster Abbey, she saw the culmination of 20 years of patient, painful maneuvering. The ceremony was a blur of gold and incense, but Augusta's eyes remained fixed on the ministers, watching for the first sign of dissent or betrayal in their bowed, powdered heads. Seeking a reprieve from the suffocating atmosphere of the court, Augusta turned her attention to the gardens at Kew. Here, she could exert a different kind of power, the power of creation and scientific discovery. She commissioned the Great Pagoda and expanded the botanical collections, turning the grounds into a world-class center for study. In the silence of the glass greenhouses, surrounded by exotic plants from distant colonies, she found a peace that the political arena denied her. It was her most enduring legacy, a living monument to a woman who sought order and beauty in a chaotic, hostile world. The search for a suitable queen for George III became Augusta's next strategic move. She needed a woman who was royal enough to satisfy the lineage, but unassuming enough not to challenge Augusta's own influence. When Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz was chosen, Augusta prepared to receive the young princess with a mixture of maternal welcome and cold scrutiny. She oversaw every detail of the arrangements, ensuring the new queen understood from the moment she landed that the Princess Dowager remained the true matriarch of the House of Hanover, a silent, immovable force behind the new throne. As George III suffered his first bouts of mysterious illness, the question of a regency became a political firestorm. Augusta fought bitterly to be named regent should her son become incapacitated. The Whig ministers, led by her many enemies, sought to exclude her, fearing her continued influence through Lord Bute. This battle was not just about politics, it was a battle for her survival. If she lost her place in the line of power, she would be cast into the irrelevance she had spent her life avoiding. The halls of the palace became a battlefield of whispers and forged documents. By the late 1760s, Augusta's health began to fail, a secret she guarded as fiercely as her political maneuvers. A cancer was growing within her, but she refused to let the court see any sign of vulnerability. She continued to receive ministers and advise her son, her voice rasping, but her mind as sharp as a blade. She watched the rise of new political factions and the growing unrest in the American colonies with a sense of grim foreboding. The world was changing faster than she could control, yet she remained anchored to her duty and her son until the very end. Princess Augusta died in 1772, leaving behind a legacy as one of the most misunderstood and powerful figures in British history. She never wore a crown, yet she shaped the man who would rule for 60 years. In her final moments, she was alone with her thoughts of a life spent in the crucible of royal ambition and survival. She had been the quiet power player, a woman who navigated the treacherous waters of the Georgian court with a steel spine and a silent tongue. As the candles flickered out in her chamber, the era of the Princess Dowager finally came to a close. The morning after the Princess Dowager's passing, a thick, sulphurous London fog swallowed the city, mirroring the somber mood within the walls of Carlton House. News of Augusta's death spread through the narrow cobblestone alleys and the grand squares alike, met with a complex mixture of public relief and private mourning. For decades, she had been the lightning rod for anti-German sentiment and political scandal. Now, in the silence of her absence, the vitriol of the press began to cool, replaced by a haunting realization that a central pillar of the Georgian court had vanished. The city waited in a breathless, gray stillness. In the private chambers of St. James's Palace, King George III sat in a state of profound, paralyzed grief. Augusta had been his architect, the woman who had meticulously crafted his moral compass and his sense of kingly duty. As he stared into the flickering embers of the hearth, the weight of the crown felt heavier than ever before. Without her counsel, the king felt unmoored, as if the very foundation of his reign had been stripped away. The loss was not merely maternal. It was the loss of his most loyal political strategist, the only person who truly understood the burden of his isolation. The preparations for the funeral were conducted with the meticulous precision Augusta would have demanded. Within the darkened halls of Westminster, the royal undertakers moved like ghosts, draping the chapel in heavy black baize. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and old stone. Every detail was scrutinized by the Lord Chamberlain, ensuring that the ceremony reflected the dignity of a woman who had fought so hard for her place in history. Despite her unpopularity in life, her departure was being staged with the grandeur of a queen, a final assertion of the power she wielded from the shadows. On the night of the funeral, the procession wound through the streets of London like a dark serpent. Torches flickered in the wind, casting dancing orange light against the soot-stained facades of the buildings. There was no cheering crowd, only the rhythmic thud of muffled drums and the slow, heavy clatter of horse hooves. The silence was punctuated only by the distant tolling of bells. Within the leaden casket, the woman who had survived the vitriol of the Prince of Wales and the machinations of Parliament was finally at rest, surrounded by the very symbols of the monarchy she had struggled to preserve. Lord Bute, the man whose name was forever linked with Augusta's in scandal, watched the proceedings from a distance. The death of the Princess Dowager marked the final end of his political influence. As he retreated into the shadows of his own estate, he began the systematic destruction of their private correspondence. The flames in his study licked at the edges of letters that contained the secrets of their partnership. He knew that history would likely be unkind to them both, painting a narrative of manipulation and illicit romance that simplified the complex reality of their shared vision for a stronger, more independent British monarchy. In the weeks following her interment, the king's ministers began the delicate task of auditing Augusta's estates. What they found was a woman of surprising frugality and hidden generosity. Her ledgers revealed vast sums spent on charitable works and the scientific advancement of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. Behind the image of the power-hungry dowager was a patron of the Enlightenment, a woman who had used her quiet influence to cultivate more than just a king. These records, written in her neat, precise hand, told a story of a life lived with careful intention, far removed from the gossip of the broadsheets. Nowhere was Augusta's legacy more visible than at Kew. The great pagoda, which she had commissioned, stood as a towering monument to her cosmopolitan tastes and her defiance of tradition. Under a brooding, overcast sky, the gardens she had nurtured continued to grow, a living testament to her foresight. While the court moved on to new scandals and new wars, the trees she had planted took root, symbolizing the quiet, enduring strength of her influence. She had transformed a private retreat into a center of global botanical knowledge, ensuring her name would survive in the soil long after it faded from the political discourse. The historical re-evaluation of Princess Augusta began almost immediately. Historians of the era struggled to reconcile the image of the most hated woman in England with the reality of the stable, dutiful king she had raised. Was she the villainous witch of Kew, as the satirists claimed? Or was she the essential guardian of the Hanoverian line? The truth lay in the gray areas between the caricatures. She had been a woman navigating a male-dominated world with the only weapons available to her: silence, patience, and a steel will. Her story became a case study in the quiet exercise of female power within a rigid royal structure. George III's long reign would eventually be marked by madness and loss, but the foundations laid by Augusta held for decades. The king remained a man of private virtue and public duty, a direct reflection of his mother's rigorous education. Even as the American colonies revolted and the world shifted beneath his feet, the image of the patriot king that Augusta had envisioned remained his guiding light. In the quiet moments of his lucidity, he often looked toward the portraits of his mother, acknowledging that his strength was a reflection of her own. She was the architect of the man, and thus, the architect of an era. Ultimately, Princess Augusta's story is one of survival and strategic silence. She never wore a crown, yet she held the threads of the British Empire in her hands during its most formative years. She remains a phantom of the Georgian era, a quiet power player who understood that true influence often leaves no footprint until long after the player has left the stage. As the 18th century drew to a close, her name was etched into the history books not as a queen, but as the woman who ensured the crown survived the storms of her time. The quiet power had spoken, and history was its echo. By the early 1760s, the political atmosphere of London was thick with suspicion. George III had ascended the throne, but the shadow of his mother, Augusta, loomed large over every royal decree. The Regency Bill of 1765 became a battleground for her influence. The Whig ministers sought to exclude her, fearing her proximity to the young king. Yet, Augusta remained a silent architect of power, maneuvering through the corridors of St. James's Palace with a grace that masked her steel. She understood that in the game of crowns, those who remain unseen are often the most dangerous to their enemies. Rumors were the currency of the Georgian court, and Augusta was its most frequent subject. The scandalous whispers linking her to the Earl of Bute were weaponized by the press to undermine the king's authority. Political pamphlets, etched with venomous caricatures, flooded the streets of London. Despite the public humiliation, Augusta did not break her silence. She tutored her son to look past the gutter press and focus on the divine right of the patriot king. Her stoicism was not a sign of weakness, but a calculated defense against a world that sought to dismantle her family's legacy. The education of George III was Augusta's primary masterpiece. Within the secluded walls of Kew and Leicester House, she sheltered him from the perceived corruption of his grandfather's court. She instilled in him a rigorous morality and a sense of duty that would eventually define his long reign. This isolation, however, created a king who was often misunderstood by his people. Augusta watched from the periphery as her son took his first tentative steps as a monarch, knowing that her lessons would be the only armor he possessed against the shifting sands of global politics. The loss of her husband, Frederick, Prince of Wales, had left a void that Augusta filled with cold, political pragmatism. She was a widow in a court of vultures, yet she managed to secure the future of her children with surgical precision. Each alliance she forged was a link in a chain designed to protect the Hanoverian line. She moved through the high-stakes world of the 18th century elite not as a queen, but as a protector. Her every move was a chess play, designed to ensure that when the dust settled, her son would stand unchallenged atop the British Empire. A foreign influence, a meddler who overstepped the traditional bounds of a dowager princess. Augusta countered their maneuvers with a network of loyalists, and a keen understanding of parliamentary procedure. She was the silent partner in the king's councils, a phantom presence whose advice was often whispered before the doors were closed. In this era of political giants, she proved that a woman's influence could be the most decisive factor in the survival of the crown. Augusta's legacy was not merely political, it was also etched into the soil of Kew. She transformed the royal gardens into a world-renowned center for botanical research, a passion she shared with Lord Bute. This scientific endeavor was her sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the court could be forgotten among the exotic flora. Yet even here, her enemies saw intrigue, claiming the gardens were a site for secret meetings. For Augusta, Kew was a testament to her vision of an enlightened Britain, a place where beauty and science flourished under the careful stewardship of the quiet power player. The arrival of Queen Charlotte changed the dynamics of the court, but Augusta did not simply fade away. She maintained a firm hand over the domestic life of the new royal couple, ensuring that the values she had instilled in George remained paramount. This led to tensions within the palace, as the young queen struggled to find her own voice beneath the watchful eye of her mother-in-law. Augusta's presence was a constant reminder of the weight of tradition. She was the guardian of the old ways, a sentinel standing watch over the transition of power from one generation to the next. As the years passed, the physical toll of a life spent in the shadows began to manifest. Augusta developed a painful throat cancer, an ailment she kept hidden from the public for as long as possible. She continued to perform her duties with a grim determination, refusing to allow her enemies to see her weakened. Even as her voice failed her, her influence remained potent. She communicated through letters and trusted messengers, her mind as sharp as ever while her body slowly betrayed her. She was a woman who had mastered the art of suffering in silence for the sake of the state. In February 1772, the end finally came for the Dowager Princess of Wales. She died as she had lived, quietly within the walls of Carlton House, surrounded by the few she truly trusted. The political world paused, unsure of how to react to the departure of its most enigmatic player. The king mourned a mother who had been his compass, while the public remained divided on her legacy. To some, she was a manipulative schemer. To others, the savior of the monarchy. As her body was prepared for burial, the fog over London seemed to grow thicker, as if the city itself was mourning its most silent ghost. The funeral of Princess Augusta was a somber affair, yet it marked the end of an era of unprecedented behind-the-scenes influence. She had navigated the treacherous waters of the Georgian court and emerged as one of the most powerful women in British history, despite never holding the title of queen. Her influence lived on in the character of George III and the stability of the crown during the American Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. She was the foundation upon which the modern monarchy was built. A quiet power that spoke through the centuries, reminding the world that the loudest voices are rarely the ones that change history. In the cold dawn following Augusta's passing, King George III stood alone in the drafty corridors of St. James's Palace. The weight of the crown felt heavier than ever without his mother's steady hand to guide his conscience. He recalled her frequent admonition to be a king, a phrase that now echoed through the silent halls like a spectral mandate. Outside, the London fog pressed against the window panes, mirroring the uncertainty of a realm facing colonial unrest. Augusta's departure was not just a personal loss, but the removal of the monarchy's most resilient pillar, leaving a young king to face the rising storms of revolution alone. The Princess Dowager's most enduring physical legacy was not found in gold or silver, but in the soil of Kew. Even after her death, the botanical gardens she had nurtured continued to flourish, a living testament to her disciplined mind and love for order. Scientists and explorers brought exotic specimens from across the globe to honor the foundation she had built. The quiet, methodical growth of the gardens mirrored her own rise to power, unassuming at first, but eventually sprawling and deeply rooted. In the mist-covered greenhouses, the air remained heavy with her presence, a reminder that her influence was as natural and unstoppable as the turning seasons. Within the clandestine corners of the court, the whispers did not cease with Augusta's burial. Courtiers and politicians gathered in candlelit chambers, debating how much of the king's current policy was still dictated by his mother's posthumous influence. Some spoke of her with resentment, labeling her a shadow queen who had overstepped her bounds, while others recognized her as the only force that had kept the Hanoverian line from fracturing. These debates were held in low tones, for even in death, the image of Princess Augusta commanded a fearful respect. Her life had been a masterclass in the exercise of soft power, a lesson her enemies could never quite unlearn. As the American Revolution began to boil over, George III often retreated to the private studies his mother had helped him curate. There, surrounded by maps and ancient treaties, he sought the stoicism she had instilled in him. Augusta had taught him that the monarchy was not merely a title, but a sacred duty to maintain order against the chaos of populism. Every firm decree he signed bore the invisible watermark of her iron will. Though the public blamed Lord North or the king himself for the escalating conflict, those close to the crown knew the stubborn resilience of the British position was a direct inheritance from the Princess Dowager. The first signs of the king's later instability were met with a profound sense of irony by the veteran members of the household. They whispered that had Augusta still been alive, her rigid discipline might have warded off the darkness clouding George's mind. Without her to act as his emotional and political anchor, the king found himself adrift in a sea of parliamentary infighting and family scandals. The stability she had spent decades building began to tremble. Her absence was a void that no advisor, no matter how skilled, could fill, proving that her role had been far more than maternal. It was foundational to the sanity of the state. Decades later, historians began to peel back the layers of the Georgian court, discovering a trove of Augusta's private correspondence. These documents revealed a woman of immense political intellect, who had navigated the misogyny of her era with surgical precision. She had managed the royal finances with an austerity that saved the crown from bankruptcy and directed the education of the heir with a clear-eyed vision for the future. The quiet power player was finally being recognized not as a mere footnote, but as the architect of the modern British identity. A woman who understood that true power is felt, not seen, and that silence can be a queen's greatest weapon. The memory of Augusta served as a silent judge for the women who followed her into the royal family. Queen Charlotte, in her early years, often felt the heavy gaze of her mother-in-law's legacy pressing down upon her. Every public appearance and every private council was measured against the standard of decorum and political acumen Augusta had set. The Princess Dowager had redefined what it meant to be a royal woman in a time of transition, shifting the role from a decorative consort to a strategic stabilizer. Her ghost haunted the chambers of Buckingham House, a reminder that the crown required a sacrifice of self for the sake of the lineage. As the 18th century drew to a close, the British monarchy stood as one of the few ancient institutions to survive the global wave of republicanism relatively intact. Much of this endurance was credited to the moral framework Augusta had established during George III's youth. By emphasizing duty, piety, and a connection to the British people over the excesses of the previous Hanoverian kings, she had inoculated the crown against the revolutionary fever spreading from France. She had traded the flamboyant power of the past for a quiet, resilient authority that could withstand the pressures of a changing world. ensuring the monarchy's survival into the next century. In the Victorian era, Queen Victoria herself would look back at the records of her great-grandmother with a sense of kinship. Augusta's emphasis on domestic virtue and the bourgeois royal family became the blueprint for the Victorian age. The quiet power player had, in effect, invented the modern concept of the royal family as a moral exemplar for the nation. No longer was the court a place of public debauchery, but a sanctuary of duty and discipline. Augusta's influence had skipped a generation, finding its ultimate fulfillment in a queen who would rule over the greatest empire the world had ever known, all built on the foundation Augusta laid. Ultimately, the story of Princess Augusta is a story of the power of the shadow. While kings fought wars and parliaments debated laws, she shaped the character of the man who held the scepter. Her life was a testament to the fact that the most profound changes in history often happen in quiet rooms, through whispered advice and the steady hand of a mother's influence. As the centuries passed, her name faded from the headlines, but her legacy remained woven into the very fabric of the British crown, a quiet, enduring power that continues to speak through the stability of the institution she saved. She was the architect of an era hidden in plain sight. The sudden death of Frederick, Prince of Wales, in 1751 sent shockwaves through the heart of the British monarchy, leaving Augusta a widow in a treacherous court. The air in Leicester House grew cold as the weight of an uncertain future descended upon her. No longer just a consort, she was now the mother of the heir apparent, George, a boy of 12. Surrounded by political vultures seeking to influence the young prince, Augusta realized that her survival and her son's legacy depended on her ability to transform from a quiet observer into a formidable architect of power, operating from the deep shadows of the palace. With Frederick gone, King George II viewed Augusta with a mixture of suspicion and cold pragmatism. The king sought to separate the young Prince George from his mother's detrimental influence, fearing her growing autonomy. Augusta, however, understood the court's machinery better than her detractors imagined. She began to fortify Leicester House, turning it into a private fortress of education and moral discipline. In the quiet corridors, she whispered to her son of duty and the divine right, molding his character away from the debauchery of his grandfather's court, ensuring that the next King of England would be a man of her making. Amidst the political isolation, Augusta found an unlikely and controversial ally in John Stuart, the third Earl of Bute. Their partnership was forged in the fires of mutual ambition and a shared vision for the young prince's future. Bute became the father figure George lacked and the strategist Augusta required. However, their close association sparked vicious rumors that echoed through the foggy streets of London. The princess and the boot became a staple of scandalous gossip, yet Augusta remained unfazed. She knew that in the game of crowns, reputation was a tool to be managed, but power was a prize to be held at all costs. Augusta's curriculum for her son was brutal and uncompromising, designed to break the cycle of Hanoverian rebellion. She isolated George from the corrupting influence of the nobility, emphasizing a life of piety, industry, and restraint. "George, be a king!" she would famously command, a mantra intended to instill a sense of absolute sovereignty. This rigid upbringing, while controversial, created a prince who was profoundly different from his predecessors, a man who valued the institution of the crown above his own desires. Augusta was not just raising a son, she was engineering the savior of a dynasty, hidden behind the closed doors of Leicester House. The Duke of Cumberland, the king's second son and a hero of Culloden, emerged as Augusta's most dangerous rival. He sought the regency for himself, viewing Augusta as a foreign interloper who threatened the stability of the realm. The battle for the regency bill became a high-stakes chess match played out in the halls of Parliament and the king's private chambers. Augusta navigated this minefield with surgical precision, utilizing her network of informants to stay one step ahead. She presented herself as the grieving widow and devoted mother, a public persona that masked the sharp-witted political operative she had truly become in the face of adversity. To the public, Augusta retreated into her botanical interests, focusing her energy on the development of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. It was a masterstroke of misdirection. While the world saw a widow tending to her plants, Kew became a sanctuary for secret meetings and a staging ground for her political maneuvers. The exotic flora she collected served as a metaphor for her own life, a rare and resilient species surviving in an environment that was often hostile to her presence. Under the guise of gardening, Augusta continued to pull the strings of the prince's household, ensuring his loyalty remained firmly with her. The press was not kind to the dowager princess. Satirical prints depicted her in compromising positions with Butte, fueling a fire of public resentment that threatened to engulf the prince's reputation. Augusta, however, understood that the loudest voices were often the most easily ignored if one held the reins of true authority. She taught George to remain indifferent to the mob, instilling in him a disdain for popular opinion that would define his later reign. This stoic resistance became her trademark, a quiet power that refused to be moved by the winds of scandal, proving that the crown's strength lay in its perceived untouchability. As King George II's health began to fail, the tension at Leicester House reached its peak. Augusta knew the moment of transition was approaching, and she doubled her efforts to insulate the prince from the king's final desperate attempts to control him. She acted as a gatekeeper, filtering information and controlling access to the future king. Her influence was so pervasive that even the most powerful ministers had to go through her to reach the prince. In these final months of the old reign, Augusta was the unofficial regent, the steady hand guiding the ship of state through the fog toward a new, uncertain horizon. Within the privacy of her chambers, the weight of her hidden role began to show. Augusta was a woman who had sacrificed her personal happiness and public standing for the sake of an institution that often despised her. The loneliness of power was her constant companion. Yet when she looked at her son, she saw the culmination of her life's work, a prince who was prepared to be a king of a different caliber. She had instilled in him the belief that the monarch must be a moral compass for the nation, a radical departure from the Hanoverian norm that would eventually change the face of the British monarchy forever. October 1760 marked the end of an era and the beginning of another. King George II was dead, and Prince George, now King George III, stood ready to ascend the throne. As the bells of London tolled, Augusta stood in the shadows of the coronation preparations, watching her son take his first steps as monarch. Her task was largely complete. She had secured the succession and shaped the man who would lead Britain into a new century. Though the crown would rest on his head, the spirit of the reign had been forged in the crucible of Augusta's iron will and her silent, enduring power. In the chilly dawn of his reign, George III addressed his Privy Council, his voice steady, but his eyes frequently darting toward the heavy oak doors. Behind those doors, in a room filled with the scent of stale wax and ancient parchment, Augusta waited. She did not need to be in the room to command it. Her instructions were etched into the very cadence of his speech. The transition of power was seamless, a testament to the years she had spent insulating him from his grandfather's courtiers. As the ministers bowed to their new sovereign, Augusta felt the first stirrings of a hard-won triumph. The court of St. James was a labyrinth of shifting loyalties, and the arrival of a young king meant a frantic scramble for favor. Yet, it soon became clear that the path to the king's ear ran directly through his mother's apartments at Leicester House. Augusta, now the Princess Dowager, became the most scrutinized woman in England. Critics whispered that she was the power behind the throne, a shadow queen who refused to relinquish the reins. She met these rumors with a stony silence, knowing that in the game of monarchy, visibility was often a liability, and true power thrived in the dark. Augusta knew that to secure George's position, he needed a queen who would be a partner, not a rival. She meticulously vetted the princesses of Europe, seeking a woman of virtue and discretion who would not challenge her own influence. Her choice fell upon Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a minor German princess known for her modesty. Augusta pored over portraits and diplomatic reports by candlelight, her hands tracing the parchment as if she could divine the girl's temperament from the ink. This was her final act of molding the king's domestic life, ensuring his heart remained anchored to duty. When Princess Charlotte arrived on British soil, the air was thick with the scent of sea salt and anticipation. Augusta greeted her at the palace gates, not with the warmth of a mother-in-law, but with the cool appraisal of a strategist. Charlotte was young, frightened, and overwhelmed by the grandeur of the British court. Augusta offered her hand, her grip firm and unyielding. It was a silent pact. Augusta would provide the guidance necessary to survive the vipers of London, provided Charlotte accepted the hierarchy she had established. The two women stood together, a new alliance forged in the damp English fog. The royal wedding was a spectacle of gold and white. But for Augusta, it was a tactical maneuver. As the vows were exchanged in the chapel royal, she stood slightly behind the royal couple, her eyes never leaving her son. She watched as George placed the ring on Charlotte's finger, noting the slight tremor in his hand. The crowd cheered, but Augusta's mind was already moving toward the future. She had provided him with a wife, a legacy, and a shield against the political storms that were already gathering on the horizon. To her, the ceremony was not a beginning, but a fortification. The king's reliance on Lord Bute, Augusta's closest confidant, began to draw the ire of the Parliament. To the public, Bute was the Scotch favorite, and his proximity to Augusta fueled scandalous rumors that threatened to tarnish the crown. Augusta and Bute met frequently in the private gardens, their figures obscured by the mist. They spoke in hushed tones about policy and patronage, aware that their partnership was the engine of the king's government. Despite the rising tide of vitriol in the press, Augusta refused to distance herself from the man she trusted most, standing defiant against the growing political unrest. As the 7 Years' War drew to a close, the struggle for peace became as treacherous as the battlefield. Augusta pushed for a swift conclusion to the conflict, urging George to prioritize British stability over the endless continental squabbles that had drained his grandfather's treasury. She sat with the king over maps of the colonies, her finger tracing the boundaries of an expanding empire. She argued that a king's first duty was to his own soil, not to German electorates. Her influence was instrumental in shaping the Peace of Paris, a treaty that would define the British Empire for a century, though her name was nowhere on the document of defiance. From behind the heavy curtains of Carlton House, Augusta watched the orange glow of the bonfires in the distance. The shouts of the mob echoed through the stone halls, calling for the end of her influence. She did not flinch. She had survived the death of her husband and the hatred of a king. The cries of the commoners were merely a temporary storm she intended to weather with her head held high. Seeking a sanctuary from the poisonous atmosphere of the court, Augusta poured her energy into the gardens at Kew. What had begun as a modest hobby became a grand botanical endeavor, a living testament to her vision. She commissioned rare seeds from across the globe, transforming the landscape into a sanctuary of order and beauty. Amidst the exotic trees and the quiet paths, she found a peace that the political arena denied her. Here, she was not the dowager princess or the king's mother, but a creator, building a legacy of science and nature that would outlast the scandals of her era. As the foundations of the great pagoda were laid at Kew, Augusta stood before the rising structure, a symbol of her enduring reach. It was a bold, exotic statement in the heart of the English countryside, much like her own presence in the Hanoverian line. She realized that while her direct political power might wane as George grew more independent, her cultural influence was just beginning. She had shaped the king, guided the queen, and now she was shaping the very land itself. Augusta looked up at the skeletal frame of the pagoda, a silent architect of an age that was finally learning to fear her silence. By the late 1760s, the once formidable Princess Dowager found her influence under siege, not by foreign enemies, but by the relentless passage of time and a changing court. Within the dimly lit corridors of Carlton House, Augusta maintained a rigid schedule, though her breath often came in labored rattles. She watched the younger generation of politicians and courtiers move through the halls like ghosts, realizing that her role as the king's primary advisor was being eclipsed by ministers who did not fear her stare. Yet, she remained the matriarch, a shadow in the throne room who still held the keys to the king's conscience. A rare meeting with George III revealed the widening rift between mother and son. The king, now settled into his reign and family life, spoke of policy with a firmness that Augusta had not predicted. He no longer looked to her for every nod of approval, and the silence between them grew heavy with the weight of unsaid things. Augusta realized that the boy she had molded into a king had finally outgrown the mold. She sat in the high-backed chair, her hands trembling slightly beneath her lace cuffs, observing the sovereign she had created as he moved beyond her reach. The public's animosity toward Augusta did not fade with her withdrawal from the spotlight. If anything, the mystery of her seclusion fueled more vicious rumors. Slanderous pamphlets circulated the London streets, depicting her as a puppet master and Lord Bute as her secret lover. Augusta read these accounts by the fire, her expression unreadable. She knew that history was being written by the ink of her enemies, yet she refused to issue a public defense. To her, the dignity of the crown was preserved through silence, even if that silence was interpreted as guilt by the masses. Augusta sought solace in the soil of Kew, where her botanical legacy was taking root. Amidst the rare specimens brought back from the farthest reaches of the empire, she found a control that eluded her in politics. She spent her afternoons consulting with gardeners and architects, overseeing the planting of exotic flora that would eventually define the royal botanic gardens. In the quiet of the nursery, surrounded by the scent of damp earth and green life, she wasn't the dowager princess under fire. She was the architect of a natural world that would outlive the Hanoverian scandals. As night fell over the gardens, Augusta sat alone at her desk, surrounded by the archives of her life. The letters from her deceased husband, Frederick, and the early correspondence with Lord Bute lay scattered like fallen leaves. She realized that power was a lonely pursuit, and the walls she had built to protect her family had also served to isolate her. The shadows in the room seemed to move with the memories of old alliances and forgotten betrayals. She was a woman who had played the long game, and as the clock ticked, the cost of her victory became clear. In the winter of 1771, a persistent pain in Augusta's throat signaled the beginning of her final battle. She hid her illness from the court for as long as possible, refusing to let the vultures see any sign of weakness. Her voice became a hoarse whisper, and the effort to swallow was a daily agony. Despite the physical decay, she maintained her poise, appearing at state functions with a stoic mask that baffled her physicians. She knew her time was drawing to a close, and she intended to exit the stage with the same iron resolve she had arrived with. The fireplace at Carlton House became the final resting place for many of Augusta's most private documents. In a desperate bid to protect the king and her own reputation, she spent nights feeding letters and diaries into the flames. Each bundle of parchment represented a secret, a political maneuver, or a personal confidence that she would not allow the historians to dissect. The orange light of the fire flickered across her face, illuminating a woman who was literally burning her history to ensure the survival of her legacy. She would leave behind only what she chose to be remembered. Lord Bute, once her closest confidant and the subject of so much public ire, had long been pushed to the periphery of power. His absence in her final days was a testament to the brutal nature of political survival. Augusta found herself increasingly alone, as the men she had elevated moved to distance themselves from her fading influence. The palace halls felt colder, the silence deeper. She realized that the quiet power player had become too quiet, her voice now barely a whisper in the ears of those who were already looking toward the next reign. Outside the windows of Kew, the great pagoda stood tall in the evening mist, a silent sentinel over the landscape Augusta had transformed. As the fog rolled in from the Thames, the structure appeared like a ghost of her ambitions. It was a piece of the East in the heart of England, a testament to her vision that remained untouched by the scandals of the city. She looked out at it one last time, recognizing that while the court would forget her name, the land itself would bear her mark for centuries to come. The architect's work was done. King George III visited his mother in her final hours, the weight of the crown heavy upon him as he stood by her bedside. There were no grand proclamations or political instructions left to give. In the quiet of the room, the king took the hand of the woman who had sacrificed her reputation to secure his throne. It was a moment of somber reconciliation, two figures bound by blood and the heavy burden of duty. As the candles burned low, the era of Princess Augusta began to dissolve into the shadows of history, leaving a legacy written in gardens and kings. The flicker of the last candle mirrored the fading pulse of Princess Augusta. On February 8, 1772, the Dowager Princess of Wales finally succumbed to the cancer that had ravaged her throat. Her passing was not marked by a sudden gasp or a final word, but by a heavy, absolute silence that descended upon Carlton House. George III, the king she had shaped through iron will and whispered counsel, sat motionless as the royal physicians bowed their heads. The woman who had been the most hated and most influential mother in England was gone, leaving a void no courtier could ever hope to fill. News of the Dowager's death spread through the London fog like a chill wind. At St. James's Palace, black crape was hung over the gilded mirrors, and the bells of Westminster began their rhythmic, somber tolling. To the public, she was still the Witch of Kew, the woman they blamed for the king's unpopular decisions and the perceived corruption of Lord Bute. Yet, behind the palace walls, the loss was felt as the collapse of a foundation. The official mourning period began, a theatrical display of grief that masked the complex relief and profound sorrow of a family she had dominated for decades. In the days following her death, George III retreated into his private chambers, surrounded by the letters and maps his mother had helped him study. The king found himself grappling with a newfound autonomy that felt more like abandonment. Augusta had been his shield against the world, the architect of his morality, and his most trusted advisor. Without her, the whispers of the court seemed louder, the demands of Parliament more pressing. He looked at her empty chair, the fabric still bearing the ghost of her presence, realizing that the quiet power player had left him with a crown that felt heavier than ever. Of London, the carriage moved toward London. The carriage moved toward Westminster Abbey, escorted by guards bearing torches that cast long, dancing shadows against the brickwork. There were no cheering crowds, only a handful of curious onlookers peering through the fog. The rhythmic clopping of horse hooves on cobblestones served as the only eulogy for a woman who had spent her life navigating the treacherous waters of the British court with cold, calculated grace. While the political world moved on, Augusta's most enduring legacy remained rooted in the soil of Kew Gardens. The exotic plants she had imported from the furthest reaches of the empire continued to grow, indifferent to the death of their patron. The Great Pagoda, which she had commissioned as a symbol of her sophisticated taste, stood as a tall, silent sentinel over the landscape. It was here, amidst the greenery and the glass houses, that her influence was most tangible. She had transformed a private retreat into a scientific marvel, proving that her vision extended far beyond the petty squabbles of the Georgian court. With Augusta gone, the remaining members of her inner circle found themselves adrift. Lord Bute, once the most powerful man in the kingdom by her side, felt the final threads of his influence snap. The rumors of their illicit romance, which had fueled 1,000 scandalous pamphlets, began to transition from current gossip into historical legend. Bute retreated to his estates, a man haunted by the memory of the woman who had elevated him and then left him to face the world's scorn alone. The era of their joint shadow rule was over, leaving only dusty records and bitter memories. Queen Charlotte, once the timid bride Augusta had sought to control, now found herself the undisputed matriarch of the royal household. The transition was subtle but absolute. As she walked through the halls of Windsor, Charlotte felt the weight of Augusta's gaze from the portraits on the walls. The power dynamic had shifted. The lessons of stoicism and duty that Augusta had forced upon her were now the very tools Charlotte used to manage her own growing family and a king whose mental health was beginning to show its first faint fractures. The student had finally become the master of the palace. In the months following the funeral, a silent purge of Augusta's private papers began. George III, ever protective of his mother's honor and the crown's dignity, ordered the most sensitive correspondence to be sequestered or destroyed. Letters that spoke of political maneuvers, private anxieties, and the true nature of her relationship with Bute were consigned to the flames or locked in iron-bound chests. This intentional erasure ensured that Augusta would remain a mystery to future historians. A woman whose true thoughts were buried as deep as her body in the royal vault, leaving only the public image she had carefully curated. As the 1770s progressed, the court of George III transformed into a bastion of domesticity and rigid morality, a direct reflection of the values Augusta had championed. The quiet power player had succeeded in her ultimate goal, the survival and strengthening of the Hanoverian line. Her influence lived on in the way her son conducted his reign, emphasizing the king's personal virtue over political popularity. Yet, the shadows of the past remained. The mystery of the woman who had navigated the most turbulent years of the monarchy persisted, a ghost in the machinery of state that she had so painstakingly rebuilt. History would remember Princess Augusta as a polarizing figure, a meddling mother, a devoted widow, and a visionary botanist. But to those who walked the halls of Kew or the corridors of St. James, she was the silent architect of an era. As the fog of time began to settle over her story, her image remained fixed in the muted colors of her portraits. a woman of iron will shrouded in silk. The saga of the Georgian era would continue, but the foundation laid by Augusta would support the weight of the empire for generations to come, her quiet power echoing through the ages. As the 1770s dawned, the legacy of Princess Augusta began to take root in the very soil of Kew. No longer just a retreat for a grieving widow, the gardens became a center of scientific enlightenment. Augusta watched from her windows as rare specimens from across the globe arrived in wooden crates, evidence of an empire expanding under her son's rule. She had transformed her personal sanctuary into a botanical powerhouse, ensuring that her name would be whispered not just in the halls of power, but in the rustling leaves of exotic trees that would outlive the dynasty itself. The political storms never truly ceased, yet Augusta remained the steady anchor for King George III. Even as her health began to falter, she was the silent recipient of state secrets, the advisor whose words carried the weight of decades of survival. In the dimly lit corridors of St. James's, her presence was felt like a cool draft, unseen but impossible to ignore. She had mastered the art of quiet influence, navigating the treacherous waters of the British court with a resilience that baffled her detractors and fortified the monarchy during its most uncertain hours. Augusta's focus eventually shifted to the next generation, observing her grandchildren with the same scrutinizing eye she had once trained on her son. She saw in them the future of the House of Hanover, a lineage she had fought tooth and nail to protect. Among them was the young Prince of Wales, a boy who would one day become George IV. She whispered lessons of duty and decorum, her voice a low rasp in the quiet nurseries. She was the matriarch of an empire, weaving the threads of character into the fabric of the future king. By 1772, the iron will that had sustained Augusta for decades began to succumb to the frailty of the flesh. Diagnosed with cancer, she faced her end with the same stoic defiance that had characterized her arrival in England 40 years prior. She refused to let the court see her agony, masking her pain with silk and ceremony. In her final days at Carlton House, she looked back on her journey from a young, confused princess of Saxe-Gotha to the most powerful woman in Britain. The shadows were lengthening, but her resolve remained unbroken. On the night of February 8th, the light in Augusta's chambers finally went out. King George III, her devoted son, stayed by her side until the very end, his grief a testament to the bond they had forged in the fires of political scandal. Her death marked the end of an era, the passing of the last great architect of the early Georgian court. The news spread through London like a chill wind, silencing the gossip mongers for a brief moment of national mourning. The woman of iron was gone, leaving behind a crown she had saved and a son she had molded. The funeral of Princess Augusta was a somber affair, draped in the black velvet of royal tradition. Through the fog-choked streets of London, the procession moved toward Westminster Abbey. The rhythmic clip-clop of horses and the tolling of bells provided the soundtrack to her final journey. While the crowds were thin and the mood ambivalent, those within the inner circles of power knew what had been lost. She was interred in the royal vault, laid to rest among the kings and queens she had spent her life serving, outmaneuvering, and ultimately surpassing in quiet strength. In the years following her death, the pamphlets that had once slandered her began to yellow and fade. History's judgment of Augusta was often harsh, colored by the misogyny of her time and the jealousy of her rivals. She was remembered as the Dowager, a meddling figure of the shadows. Yet, beneath the layers of historical bias, lay the truth of a woman who had successfully navigated the most dangerous court in Europe. She had secured her children's futures and protected the throne when it was at its most vulnerable, a feat few could claim. Nowhere was Augusta's presence more alive than in the gardens of Kew. The small botanical collection she had championed grew into the premier institution of its kind in the world. Every tree planted under her direction became a monument to her vision. Scientific explorers like Joseph Banks would continue her work, bringing back the wonders of the world to the sanctuary she created. Augusta had proved that power was not just found in the stroke of a pen or the command of an army, but in the slow, persistent growth of knowledge and beauty. Princess Augusta remained the silent architect of the Georgian era, her influence woven into the very fabric of the British monarchy. Her commitment to the education of the king and the preservation of royal dignity set the stage for the long reigns of her descendants. She was the woman who understood that in the Game of Thrones, survival was the ultimate victory. As the decades passed, her portrait in the royal galleries seemed to watch the unfolding history with a knowing, subtle smile. The smile of a woman who had played the long game and won. The story of Princess Augusta is one of resilience shrouded in silk, a narrative of power exercised from the margins. She navigated the transition from a foreign princess to a British matriarch with a tenacity that defined an era. As the fog of time settles over her life, she remains a figure of mystery and iron will, a reminder that the most significant players in history are often the ones who speak the least but see the most. The foundation she laid supported the weight of an empire, her quiet power echoing through the ages, forever a part of the British royal saga.